What thesis even asserted from its first moment that interest could not be justified? Why even did they imitate the findings they only compromised, but for the prevailing validity of what they only compromised? What thesis altogether unravels, accounts, and resolves the present obfuscation of our currency? Why then did they even seek to compromise those findings, but for their own undue profit? The battle against interest was hard fought. In its beginning, almost everyone merely scoffed, but who would lend us money if the risk of doing so weren't subject to interest? Today, nonetheless, as if the very same people never held to a false tenet they never once in their lives justified, it is simply assumed now that we can no longer suffer or assent to interest. Yet still we can hardly understand how and why, if we do not understand not only that interest is usury, but that interest is both unjustifiable and terminal. Because in fact we do not borrow money from banks. On the contrary, purported banking systems merely publish further representations of our very own promissory obligations to each other. On the contrary, in every purported creation of money, purported banking systems merely create a device to perpetually escalate our unwarranted dispossession. Yet even rather than actually borrowing this purported money or actual device into circulation, we do not borrow the obfuscation into circulation at all. We do not borrow money into circulation from a purported banking system. The purported banking system merely publishes evidence of our own promissory obligations to each other. These promissory obligations, or notes, which are promises to pay, are not even debts. Much less can they be debts to a purported banking system which gives up no lawful consideration whatsoever, commensurable to the purported debt to the bank, which the bank pretends to create. These instead are merely obligations to pay and to retire principal as we consume of the related property. For this is the only thing which can possibly maintain the integrity of the circulation to both the real creditor who gave up property for the promissory obligation and to the obligor who must pay for that property at least as they consume of it. Nothing else but unexploited payment of the principal, retiring principal at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property, can maintain the vital one-to-one-to-one relationship, which alone can maintain the integrity of the currency. Even the purported debts against which pretenders cry out in response, money cannot be a debt, debt is the problem, money must be spent into circulation, money must be a gift. Even all these already defeated propositions have no valid complaint about promissory obligations, for they are not even debts, but obligations to pay for what we consume as we consume of it. The common monetary foundry of a mathematically perfected economy, in fact, actually resolves any purported debts as they arise by automatically retiring principal from circulation. In fact, then, all the issues before us are even resolved without regulation by no more than adoption of the only rightful accounting system for the facts at hand, which essentially only eradicates exploitation and imposes an indispensable obligatory schedule of payment. Today now, despite all this deviation and division, ever more and more of us understand that interest is entirely unacceptable. But why? How could we possibly understand such a thing if the proposition we suffer from a Ponzi scheme can't possibly explain our predicament? If we are to prevail over both ourselves and our enemies, then, we must hold each other, every one of us, accountable for our positions on these matters. For our division is not only a lack of resolution, it is the very fact of irresponsibility and irreverence by which we condemn ourselves to the path of usury. For we will never conquer the imposition of usury if we cannot unite over a fact of solution. As we have taught already for 4 decades now, there is one solution for inflation, deflation, and maldisposition. We know this by the most elementary math, for if inflation and deflation are respective increases or decreases in circulation per represented value, and if perpetual escalation of falsified indebtedness in proportion to a circulation is imposed by interest, then the only solution of inflation, deflation, and maldisposition eradicates interest and necessarily pays and retires principal at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property. Likewise, we have taught that there is but one solution too for systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property, because every such offense against us is a product of an unjustifiable imposition of interest and/or a conjunct lack of the same obligatory schedule of payment. And likewise, we have taught across the same 43 years that there is but one solution for inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest. The only solution of the latter, then, is an eradication of interest, particularly because our proof of a purposed obfuscation of our promissory obligations itself even proves no justification for interest can possibly exist, because no lawful consideration is given up by the bank, and because, therefore, no property of the bank is ever even truly at risk. We do not borrow money into circulation from banks. Purported banking systems merely publish evidence of the very promissory obligations we are forced, without warrant, to issue through the purported banking system. If we were borrowing, we were only borrowing evidence of our very own contracts. But certainly there is no lawful or actual debt to a purported banking system which never even gives up lawful consideration commensurable to the falsified debts it claims. Particularly as this ever unjustifiable obfuscation, therefore, explains our entire predicament. Why then have we not united, but that we ourselves have failed to hold every 11th hour pretender accountable? When I was young, as a consequence of needless controversy, I thought about the pattern by which not only I, but others learned things. And one day soon, I realized that, except as pertains to finite systems with finite operations and finite outcome, I might not know anything. In fact, I realized even, in the most concrete terms, that but only for such exceptions, in fact, I probably knew prospectively nothing at all. What do I mean by this proposition? As we first perceive or conceive of anything, our first idea of the scope of it we behold may or may not be perfect, depending always upon whether we have correctly and completely perceived the scope and its every meaningful attribute. Every stage of further contemplation or perception, until our perception is free of imperfection, is analogous then to different people observing only certain facets of a multifaceted object from observation points which can only see the surfaces of some one side. Not knowing the whole and attempting to provide descriptions for different, only partial perspectives, which would somehow nonetheless account for the whole, we can only err in pretending to account for what we cannot or have not. However, on the other hand, then, only if we restrict ourselves to providing descriptions of our perspective which do not pretend to know anything further of the whole, which is inaccessible to our observation, and which contingent descriptions, therefore, in turn, accommodate every further truthful observation possible, then and then only will our every report comprise at least a veritable, itself irrefutable part of an eventual full knowledge of the whole. Only perspectives, therefore, which pretend at nothing, and which are always open to anything we might not have correctly assumed then,